There's something about cold that sticks with you. Not just the physical kind that bites at your skin, but the kind that settles deep, where you don't even realize you're shivering until someone reaches out and touches you. That winter, the cold was everywhere, outside the house, inside it, and maybe most of all between me and the man I thought I knew better than anyone, the man I married thinking love would always be enough to keep me warm. We'd driven up through the winding roads of upstate New York, Eric at the wheel, my grandma Martha in the back, her voice a steady hum as she pointed out landmarks that hadn't changed since I was a kid. And I watched the trees blur past, bare and stiff under the weight of early snow, wondering if I'd ever feel that kind of familiarity again. The house, her house, stood like it always had, weathered but proud, with its sagging porch and shutters that never quite closed right. And even though I hadn't been there in months, it still smelled like old books, wood smoke, and something sweeter I could never place. Like a memory you almost catch before it slips away. The second we stepped inside, I knew the heat wasn't working right. That familiar chill wrapping around my legs, sliding under my coat, making me regret not grabbing thicker socks. And Eric, ever the optimist, just clapped his hands together and said he'd get the stove going. Like that would fix everything. While Grandma disappeared into the kitchen, muttering about finding her good teapot. Now, I should have gone upstairs, unpacked, maybe crawled under the layers of quilts she always kept on the beds. But something made me stay. Standing near the old wood stove in the living room, watching the fire try to catch, little sparks snapping like they were mad about being disturbed. That's when Tom walked in. Tom, my grandmother's new husband, the man I barely knew but somehow felt like I'd known forever. Not because of anything he did or said, but because of the way he carried himself. Like he belonged everywhere. Like nothing could rattle him, not even a night as cold as this one. He had that easy smile, the kind that didn't ask questions, and in his hands he held a bottle of bourbon and two glasses, raising an eyebrow like it was the most natural thing in the world. And I remember thinking, just for a second, that maybe a drink wouldn't hurt, just to take the edge off. We sat near the stove, closer than I expected, the fire finally catching, throwing shadows on the walls, and he poured the bourbon, sliding a glass into my hands, his fingers brushing mine just enough to notice, just enough to wonder if it meant anything at all. I took a sip, the warmth hitting me fast, and we didn't talk much. Just listened to the crackle of the fire and the wind outside. That kind of silence that's not awkward but heavy, like something's waiting. At some point, he reached behind the couch, pulled out this old wool blanket, thick and scratchy but warm, and draped it over both of us without asking. Like it was just what you did when it was cold. Like it didn't mean anything. But it did. I could feel the heat from his leg pressing against mine. The way his arm settled along the back of the couch. Not quite touching, but close enough. And I told myself it was fine. That this was normal. That I was just cold and tired and needed the warmth. He looked over at me, not smiling now, just watching. And I felt my breath catch, my heart doing that thing it hadn't done in a long time. Not for Eric, not for anyone. That little stutter like something inside me was waking up. His hand moved, slow, deliberate, pulling the blanket tighter around my shoulders, and when his fingers brushed the side of my neck, I didn't flinch. I should have, but I didn't. I sat there, staring into the fire, pretending I didn't notice how close he was, pretending I didn't want him to move even closer. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low, rough from the cold or the bourbon or maybe something else. And I nodded, not trusting my voice to sound normal. His hand stayed there, light on my shoulder, and when he leaned in, when his lips touched my cheek, just for a second, soft and careful, I didn't move away. I don't know why I didn't. Maybe because it didn't feel wrong. Not in that moment. Maybe because I needed to feel something. Anything. And his touch was the only thing cutting through the numbness that had been sitting with me for longer than I wanted to admit. He pulled back. Just enough to look at me. To really look. And I turned my head without thinking, our faces inches apart. "You're cold," he said again, like it was an excuse. Like that explained everything. And before I could answer, his lips found mine. Slow. Questioning. But sure. The kiss wasn't deep. Wasn't desperate. It was quiet. Like both of us knew we shouldn't but didn't care. When he pulled away, I didn't say anything. Just looked down at my hands, still holding that glass, now almost empty. He stood, took the glass from me, set it aside, and held out his hand. "Come on," he said. "You'll freeze out here." I let him lead me to the couch by the stove, where he laid down first, pulling me beside him, the blanket still wrapped tight. "Just to stay warm," he whispered. And I believed him, or wanted to. Lying there, my head on his chest, his arm around me, I told myself it was nothing, just a way to keep the cold out. But when his hand slid under my sweater, fingers tracing the skin of my back, I didn't stop him. I closed my eyes and let the heat in, just for the night, just until the cold passed. When I woke up that morning, I could feel the cold before I even opened my eyes. The kind of chill that seeps into your skin and lingers long after the fire's gone out. And for a split second, I forgot where I was. Just this haze of warmth, guilt, and the memory of his hand under my sweater. But then I felt the mattress shift next to me, the familiar weight of Eric's body beside mine. And reality hit hard, like stepping into ice water barefoot. He was lying there, on his side, still half asleep. And when he noticed me stir, he reached out, brushing my hair back gently, the way he always did. His fingers soft and trusting, and I held my breath, waiting, wondering if he could feel the difference in me. If somehow, overnight, I'd become someone he wouldn't recognize anymore. But he just smiled, eyes still heavy with sleep, and leaned in to press a kiss to my forehead, his lips warm and sure, and he whispered, "Morning, babe." Like nothing had changed. Like the world hadn't just cracked open a little more inside me. I couldn't speak. Not right then. So I just nodded, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes, and turned away, pulling the blanket tighter around me, hoping he wouldn't notice how tense I'd become, how every muscle in my body was locked in place, afraid to move, afraid that if I did, something in me would spill out. He didn't push, though Eric never pushed. He just got up, stretched, and wandered into the bathroom, humming some old tune under his breath, leaving me there alone with the silence and the pounding of my heart. I laid there, staring at the ceiling, every second from the night before playing on repeat in my head, the heat of Tom's breath, the roughness of his hands, the way I hadn't said no, hadn't pulled away. And no matter how much I tried to convince myself it was the cold, that it was just a moment of weakness, it didn't wash away. It didn't fade. By the time I got downstairs, the smell of coffee filled the kitchen, and the sound of Grandma's voice floated through the house like everything was perfectly normal, like we were just here for another family visit, another quiet weekend in the woods. But inside me, everything was sharp, every sound too loud, every light too bright, and I felt like my skin didn't fit right anymore. I walked into the room trying to steady myself, trying to play the part I'd always played, the good wife, the sweet granddaughter. But the second I saw Tom sitting there at the table, everything twisted. He looked up, and our eyes met, just for a second. But it was enough. That look, steady, unreadable, but not empty, like he was waiting for something, like he knew I wouldn't be able to ignore it for long. I tore my gaze away, pretending to fuss with the coffee pot, pretending I hadn't noticed the way his eyes lingered, but my hands shook as I poured myself a cup, and I could feel the weight of him across the room, silent but impossible to ignore. Grandma didn't see it. Of course she didn't. She was too busy telling Eric about some neighbor who'd slipped on the ice, her voice full of concern, her hands busy buttering toast. And I envied her, envied that ease, that peace of not knowing. I sat down, trying to eat, but every bite felt like sand in my mouth, and every time I looked up, Tom was there, his gaze catching mine, not with a smile, not with anything obvious, but with something that pulled at me, that made my skin tingle and my stomach knot. Eric was planning to head into town that afternoon, something about picking up supplies, maybe fixing a leak Grandma mentioned in the shed. And when he kissed me goodbye, his hands warm on my waist, his lips brushing my cheek, I felt like I might break. "You gonna be okay here?" he asked, and I nodded too quickly, forcing a laugh. "Yeah, of course, it's just a house," I said, but inside I was screaming for him to stay. To not leave me there with this mess, with this man who had already taken more from me than I knew how to handle. But he didn't hear it, didn't see it, just smiled and grabbed his coat. And a minute later, the door closed behind him, leaving me alone in a silence that wasn't silence at all. I tried to keep busy, tried to find something, anything, to distract me. But the house felt smaller without Eric, every room echoing with the sound of my own breathing, and no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I ended up in the kitchen again, staring out the window over the sink. And that's when I saw him. Tom was outside, splitting wood, his sleeves rolled up, his breath visible in the cold air, and I stood there, unmoving, watching the rhythm of his movements, the way his muscles tensed with every swing of the axe. And I hated myself for noticing. For feeling that pull again, I told myself to look away, to walk away, but I didn't. Later, as the light faded and the cold pressed in around the house, Grandma decided to head to bed early, claiming the weather always made her sleepy, and I helped her up the stairs, tucking her in like a child, my hands gentle, my smile tight. She kissed my cheek, thanked me, and closed her eyes. And I stood there for a long moment, watching her breathe, wondering how I'd ended up here, wondering how everything could feel so normal and so wrong at the same time. When I finally went back downstairs, the living room was dim, the fire low, and Tom was there, sitting in his usual chair, a glass in his hand, his eyes on the flames. I didn't want to go in. I should have gone straight to bed, should have locked the door and buried myself under the covers until Eric came back. But my feet moved on their own, carrying me into the room, and I sat down on the couch, as far from him as I could. But it didn't matter. The air between us was thick, heavy with everything we weren't saying. We sat there, the fire crackling, the wind howling outside, and for a while, neither of us spoke. Then, finally, his voice cut through the quiet. "You were cold that night," he said, not looking at me, not asking a question, just stating it like a fact. I nodded because what else could I do? "Yeah," I whispered, my hands clenched in my lap. He turned then, slowly, his eyes finding mine in the dim light. "You're still cold," he said, softer this time. And before I could answer, before I could even think, his hand moved, resting on my knee, warm and steady. I froze. My breath caught. Everything inside me screamed to pull away, to run. But I couldn't move. I felt the heat of his palm through the fabric of my jeans, felt the way his thumb brushed lightly against my skin, and something in me wavered. "No," I said suddenly, louder than I meant to, standing up so fast the blanket slipped off the couch, pooling at my feet. He didn't follow, didn't reach for me, just sat there, watching, his face unreadable. "I can't," I added, my voice shaking. But he didn't say a word. I walked out, my legs unsteady, my heart pounding, and even as I climbed the stairs, even as I closed the door behind me, I could still feel the warmth of his hand on my knee, still feel the way my body had leaned toward him before my mind caught up. And the worst part? I didn't know if I wanted to forget. That morning started like any other, except for the heavy gray sky that seemed to press down on the house, casting everything in a dull light. The kind that makes you feel like time has slowed down just a bit too much. And for a while, I thought maybe this day would pass like the one before, full of quiet avoidance and careful glances, full of me pretending and failing to forget the way his hand felt on my skin, the way his eyes followed me like he was waiting for something more. Over breakfast, Grandma mentioned her sister, something about how she hadn't been feeling well lately, and how she thought maybe a visit would cheer her up. And I knew then what was coming before she even said it, before she turned to Eric with that look she always used when she wanted something done, but didn't want to ask directly. "Would you mind driving me into town today, dear?" she asked, her voice sweet but a little too bright, as if the idea just came to her in the moment, though we both knew it hadn't. Eric, always eager to help, didn't hesitate, just smiled and nodded, already reaching for his coffee. And I felt my stomach tighten, felt the air in the room shift because I knew what it meant. I'd be alone again, with Tom, in this house that felt smaller by the hour. I tried to think of a reason to go with them, something believable, something that wouldn't make me look as desperate as I felt. But nothing came. And before I could open my mouth, Grandma was already rattling off the time they needed to leave. How the snow wasn't supposed to get bad until late. How they'd be back before dark, and Eric kissed me on the forehead, told me not to worry, told me to stay warm. And just like that, they were gone. The sound of the car crunching over the icy driveway fading until all I could hear was the wind outside and the pounding of my own heart. I stood by the window for a long time, watching the snowflakes start to fall, slow and soft, like they didn't have anywhere to be. And I told myself to stay put, to read a book, to make some tea, to do anything that didn't involve him, but the silence was loud. Too loud, and I could feel it pulling at me, pushing me towards something I didn't want to name. I was halfway through boiling water for tea when Tom walked in, wiping his hands on a rag, his eyes catching mine like they always did now. And he asked if I wanted to help him with the shed, said he'd been meaning to fix that old door in the back for weeks, and that it wouldn't take long, just a little company, something to pass the time. I should have said no. I should have laughed it off, told him I was tired, that I had things to do inside, that the cold was too much. But instead I heard myself say yes, my voice too quick, too eager. And before I knew it, I was pulling on my coat, stepping into boots that didn't quite fit right, following him out into the snow that was falling harder now, the wind picking up just enough to make me shiver. The shed was darker than I remembered, the light filtering through the cracks in the walls, dust swirling in the air, and the door he wanted to fix was in the far corner, half off its hinges, leaning like it had given up a long time ago. He handed me a flashlight, his fingers brushing mine, that same spark shooting up my arm. And we got to work. Him holding the door steady while I tried to find the right nails, the right angle, anything to keep my hands busy, to keep my mind off the fact that we were alone again, that no one was coming back for hours. It wasn't long before the space felt too small, our movements too close. His breath warm on my neck as he leaned in to hold the door. Assistant time our eyes met. I felt it again. That pull, that ache that I didn't know how to silence. I reached for something on the shelf behind me, lost my balance for real this time. And before I could fall, his arms were around me, strong, sure, pulling me against him, his hands firm on my waist. We froze like that, just for a moment. But it felt like forever, like time had stopped, like everything outside that shed had vanished. And when I looked up, his face was inches from mine. His eyes dark, searching, waiting. "Natalie," he whispered, my name sounding different in his mouth, softer, heavier. And I opened mine to speak, to tell him no, to tell him this was wrong. But the words caught in my throat, stuck behind the pounding in my chest. His lips found mine before I could stop him. And maybe I didn't want to stop him. Maybe I'd already decided long before this moment that I'd let it happen again. The kiss was different this time. Not tentative, not gentle, but deep, hungry, like he'd been holding it back too long. And I felt myself melt into it, my hands gripping his arms, my body leaning closer, until there was no space left between us. It was wrong. God, I knew it was wrong. But it didn't feel like it. Not then. Not with the heat of him against me. The way his hands tangled in my hair. The way his mouth moved with mine like he already knew every part of me. We broke apart, gasping, the air thick and hot despite the cold. And I stepped back, shaking, my fingers brushing my lips, still swollen, still burning. "I can't," I whispered, but even I didn't believe it. I ran, stumbling out of the shed, the snow hitting my face sharp and sudden, blinding me as I made my way back to the house, slamming the door behind me, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Upstairs, I locked the door, leaned against it, heart racing, and I could still taste him, still feel the weight of his kiss, the way my body had betrayed me, reaching for him, wanting more. Later, when I finally calmed down enough to think, I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling as I typed out a message to Eric, needing something normal, something solid. "Everything okay?" I wrote, staring at the screen like it could erase what I'd done. The reply came quick, too quick. "Yeah, roads are bad, but we're fine. Love you." I stared at those words, my throat tight, my eyes burning, and I wondered, could he feel it? Could he sense how far I'd already gone? It wasn't the first time, and it sure wasn't going to be the last. Not in this old house where the walls seemed to breathe with the wind and every room had its own kind of cold that no blanket could fix, no matter how many layers you piled on. I'd been sitting in my room for what felt like hours, wrapped up in a throw that smelled faintly of cedar and something older, something I couldn't name, and I'd been trying, really trying, to read, to focus, to do anything that didn't involve replaying that kiss over and over again in my head like some broken record I couldn't shut off. But the silence in that house was like a living thing, creeping into my thoughts, wrapping around me, reminding me that no matter how far I tried to run, no matter how tightly I held on to the edges of who I used to be, I was slipping. I could feel it. And worse, part of me didn't want to stop. The door creaked softly and I jumped, heart racing, the book slipping from my hands and landing on the floor with a dull thud that seemed way too loud. A moment later, there was a knock. Soft, tentative, but firm enough that I knew who it was before he even spoke. "You warm enough in there?" Tom's voice, low and steady, filtered through the door like smoke. Curling around me, I sat there, frozen, not answering at first, staring at the knob like it might turn on its own. My mind screamed to stay silent, to tell him to go away. But my mouth had other plans. "It's cold," I said, barely above a whisper, but loud enough for him to hear. The knob turned slowly, the door opening just enough for him to step inside, his eyes meeting mine in the dim light, and I couldn't breathe. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, taking me in, and then he crossed the room, every step measured, controlled, like he knew exactly how this was going to go. "I brought the heavy blanket," he said, holding up a thick wool throw. And I nodded, because what else was I going to do? He sat down beside me, close but not too close, and draped the blanket over both our shoulders, his arm brushing against mine. And the heat of him was immediate, intense, chasing away the chill but replacing it with something else entirely. We sat like that for a minute, maybe two, not speaking, just listening to the wind howl outside, the house creaking like it might split open. And then he reached up, slow and deliberate, his fingers tangling in my hair, smoothing it back from my face, and I closed my eyes because I couldn't look at him, couldn't handle what I knew I'd see. His hand didn't move, just stayed there, gentle, warm, and something inside me cracked. I turned to him, my eyes still closed, and kissed him. I don't even know if I meant to, if it was a choice or just a reflex, but the second our lips met, it didn't matter anymore. All the doubt, all the fear, all the noise in my head. Gone. Just heat. Just want. Just this moment that felt like it had been waiting for us all along. He didn't hesitate. His hands were on me, pulling me closer, fingers digging into the fabric of my sweater, yanking it over my head in one swift motion that left me gasping. Not from the cold, but from the sudden rush of everything we'd been holding back. I didn't stop him. I couldn't. My hands were everywhere, in his hair, on his shoulders, pulling at his shirt, needing him closer, needing him now. We fell back onto the bed, the blanket tangled around us, and his mouth was on my neck, my collarbone, his breath hot against my skin, and I arched into him, every nerve alive, every inch of me aching for more. "Just tonight," I whispered, my voice barely there, lost in the sound of our breathing, the rustle of sheets. He nodded, not speaking, his lips finding mine again, rougher now, more desperate, like he needed to feel me just as much as I needed him. His hands roamed, sure and steady, learning me, owning me. And I gave in, completely without thought, without fear. The world outside didn't exist. There was no Eric, no grandma, no storm, just us, just the heat of our bodies, the fire we'd tried so hard to put out, now burning out of control. When it was over, when we finally collapsed into each other, breathless, spent, the blanket pulled tight around us. I didn't move. I couldn't. His arm was draped over me, heavy, grounding, and I listened to the steady beat of his heart, trying to match it with my own. I don't know how long we lay there, but sleep came fast, dragging me under, pulling me away from the guilt that was already creeping in at the edges. And outside, the wind picked up, the snow falling harder, thicker, burying the roads, the trees, the world in white. Miles away, Eric gripped the steering wheel tighter, glancing at Martha beside him, her face lined with worry, and he made the call, turning the car around, the storm too strong, the road home calling them back sooner than anyone expected. The sound of Tom getting out of bed didn't wake me fully, just the soft rustle of the blanket lifting off his side, the faint creak of the floor as he moved across the room. Barefoot, quiet, careful not to disturb me, like he always was in those early hours before the house stirred. I stayed there, half asleep, eyes closed, body heavy with the warmth of the night before, the scent of wood smoke and him still clinging to my skin, wrapping around me like a second blanket, one I wasn't ready to let go of. The morning light was dim, barely a glow through the old curtains, and I shifted under the weight of it all. The weight of what I'd done, the weight of knowing it wasn't over yet. I heard the soft click of the door closing behind him, and for a moment I was alone. Really alone, in a way I hadn't been for days. And I let my eyes open, staring at the ceiling, tracing the cracks in the paint, wondering how many times someone had lain here before, wondering if they felt as hollow and full all at once as I did. My hand drifted up to my face, brushing hair back, fingers catching on a knot I didn't remember getting, and I exhaled slowly, thinking maybe I could stay like this just a little longer, just until the world forced me to move. Downstairs, Tom was stoking the fire, adding logs to the stove, moving with that same quiet efficiency he always had. And I imagined him there, his hands blackened with soot, his brow furrowed just enough to show he cared, not enough to make him worry. I didn't know then, couldn't have known that outside, just a few miles down the road, Eric was gripping the steering wheel tighter than he needed to, his eyes darting between the road ahead and the sky above. The storm having turned them around, forced them back, the roads too dangerous, the snow too thick, and that each mile they drove brought him closer to something neither of us was ready for. The door downstairs opened suddenly, not loud, but enough to cut through the morning stillness. And I sat up, heart skipping, hands clutching at the blanket as I tried to make sense of it, tried to convince myself it was Tom, just Tom, back with tea or breakfast or something else simple and normal and easy. But then I heard it. His voice. Eric's voice. Low at first. A muttered curse about the cold, about the storm. And I froze. The breath caught in my throat. The room spinning just enough to make me dizzy. They were back. They weren't supposed to be back. I scrambled, the blanket slipping, my hands grabbing for anything. For clothes, for scents. But I couldn't move fast enough. Couldn't make the room right. Couldn't make myself right. And the sound of his footsteps on the stairs was too loud, too real, each one a hammer blow that echoed through me. I heard Martha's voice, faint, asking something, but it faded into the background, drowned out by the pounding in my chest, the sharp, breathless panic that took over every thought, every muscle. As the door to the room opened, Eric stood there, his hand still on the knob, his eyes wide, and the second he saw me, saw the bed, saw the clothes still scattered, saw the blanket I pulled tighter around me. His face changed. The confusion was first, flickering across his features like he couldn't quite process what he was seeing. And then the realization hit. Hard, brutal, turning his expression into something I didn't recognize. Something that made me want to disappear, to sink into the floor, to become anything but what I was. Nat? His voice cracked. One word, one broken syllable that held everything. Disbelief, anger, hurt, all of it crashing into me like a wave I couldn't stand against. I opened my mouth, tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Stuck behind the tears that were already blurring my vision, and I shook my head, desperate, pleading, but silent. And then Tom walked in. He didn't knock, didn't pause, just stepped into the room with a mug in his hand, steam rising from it. His eyes on me, not yet seeing Eric, not yet realizing the storm wasn't just outside. The moment stretched, unbearable, as Eric turned, his body rigid, his hands clenched. And when their eyes met, When Tom finally understood, something in the room snapped. "What the hell is this?" Eric's voice was sharp, loud, cutting through the air like a knife, and I flinched, pulling the blanket tighter, wishing it could shield me from what was happening, from what was about to happen. Tom didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, the mug still in his hand, his face unreadable, calm in a way that made it worse, that made Eric's anger grow, feed on the silence. "Answer me," Eric shouted, stepping forward, and I stumbled back, my legs unsteady, the blanket falling, my hands reaching, failing, and I felt the tears spill over, hot and useless. I didn't mean, I started, but it didn't matter. The words meaningless. Too late. Far too late. Martha was on the stairs now, her voice calling out, worried, afraid, and she appeared in the doorway just as Eric turned on Tom, his chest heaving, his fists tight at his sides. "You, of all people, you?" He spat, the betrayal thick in every word, and Tom finally spoke, finally looked him in the eye. "I didn't plan this," he said, his voice low, steady, and I hated him for it. For the calm, for the control, for the way he stood there like this wasn't tearing us apart. Martha gasped, her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide as they darted between us, and the silence that followed was worse than the shouting, worse than the storm outside because it was final. Absolute, the kind that leaves no room for anything else. Eric turned to me one last time, his eyes hollow, and without another word he walked out. Past Tom, past Martha, down the stairs, out the door, and the sound of it slamming shut behind him was the only thing that kept me standing. The door slammed so hard the windows shook, and for a moment, all I could hear was the echo of it bouncing off the walls, rattling through my chest like thunder that didn't want to leave. And I stood there, too stunned to move, too numb to cry. The blanket still clutched around me like it could protect me from the storm that had already passed. Eric was gone. He didn't say goodbye, didn't look back, didn't ask for anything, just walked out into the snow with his head down, his steps sure and fast, the sound of his boots crunching on the frozen ground fading quicker than I could catch my breath. My hands trembled, not from the cold this time, but from the weight of everything I'd just destroyed, from the sudden emptiness that filled the space where his trust used to be. And I wanted to call out, to stop him, but the words wouldn't come. They never do when it's too late. Behind me, I heard Grandma's voice break, the sharp edge of her pain cutting through the thick silence, and I turned just in time to see her face twist in a way I'd never seen before. A mix of heartbreak and fury, of disbelief and something deeper, something that looked too much like betrayal. She wasn't looking at me, though. Her eyes were locked on Tom, her husband, the man she thought she knew. And her hands shook as she pointed at him, her voice rising, cracking, spilling out in waves. "Get out," she said, over and over, louder each time, her tears falling fast, her body leaning against the doorframe like she needed something to hold her up because he sure wasn't going to. Tom didn't argue. He didn't shout, didn't defend himself, didn't even look at her as she sobbed, begging him to leave, to disappear, to never come back. He just nodded, slow and calm, like this was just another task to check off, another mess to clean up. And he turned away, walking to the small room they shared, pulling open drawers, grabbing what little he'd brought into this house, stuffing it into a bag without a word. I watched from the hallway, frozen, unable to speak, unable to move, as if I wasn't really there, as if I'd become just another part of the furniture, another thing to be ignored. Grandma turned on me then, her eyes wild, her mouth opening like she wanted to scream, but nothing came out. And she shook her head over and over like if she just kept moving, she could erase me, could make me vanish along with everything else she'd lost. She didn't speak to me, not once, didn't ask why, didn't demand answers. Maybe she already knew there weren't any that would make sense, not the kind that would fix what I'd done. Her sobs filled the house, loud and raw, and I felt each one like a slap, like a reminder that this wasn't just about me and Tom, that the damage we'd done stretched further, deeper, touching everyone who had trusted us. Tom walked past me carrying his bag, his face blank, his steps slow, and for a second, I thought he might stop, might say something, anything. But he didn't. He didn't even look at me, just opened the door, the cold air rushing in, swirling around us like it was trying to take the last of the warmth with it. And then he was gone, his figure swallowed up by the snow, leaving only the sound of Grandma's crying and the faint creak of the door settling back into place behind him. I found myself at the window, hands pressed to the cold glass, watching Eric's car disappear down the road, the snow falling harder now, covering his tracks, erasing every sign he'd ever been here. And I wondered if I'd ever see him again, if he'd ever come back, or if this was it, the end of everything I'd known, everything I'd been too blind to hold on to. My reflection stared back at me, pale and hollow, eyes rimmed red, lips trembling. And I thought about how it all started, how something as simple as cold could lead to something this broken, this irreversible. It had just been a blanket, just a fire, just a need for warmth. But somewhere in that need, I'd lost myself, traded comfort for chaos, traded love for something I couldn't even name now. I thought about that first night, about the way Tom had looked at me, the way I'd let him, and I hated myself for it. Hated how easy it had been to slip, how fast the lines blurred between right and wrong when you're desperate enough to feel something. Grandma sat on the couch, her face buried in her hands, her body shaking, and I didn't know what to do. Didn't know how to reach her, didn't know if she'd ever let me. The space between us felt wider than ever, filled with silence that screamed louder than any words could, and I stayed by the window, afraid to move, afraid that if I did, I'd shatter whatever fragile thing was left holding me together. As the day turned to night, the house grew colder, the fire long gone, just a few dying embers glowing faintly in the hearth, and I knelt in front of it, trying to coax the flames back, but the wood wouldn't catch. No matter how many times I struck the match, no matter how close I held it. My hands ached. My eyes burned, and I sat back, staring at the dim light, wondering if maybe the fire knew better than I did. If maybe it understood that some things aren't meant to burn forever. I pulled the blanket around me, the same one that had started it all, and curled up on the floor, watching the last of the embers fade, the room darkening with each passing minute. And I thought about what came next, about how you pick up the pieces when you don't even know where to start. The silence was heavy, thick, wrapping around me like a second skin, and I closed my eyes, letting it swallow me, letting it remind me that some mistakes don't get forgiven, some fires don't get reignited. And as the last flicker of light disappeared, I realized I didn't know how to be warm anymore.